right after Pearl Harbor, this country, or the world actually, was stunned and didn't quite know what to do. And this is one of the things that got us out of that hole in the ground to figure out what to do. It boosted the morale of the whole country, and that kind of set the tone. But it also was very significant to Japan, in as much as the Japanese suddenly realized, having been told for years that their nation was inviolate because it was so far away from potentially enemy countries, and all of a sudden they realized that they were vulnerable, and that changed the whole defensive mindset of the Japanese nation, to the point where they moved several units, a significant number of units, towards a defensive role, and that stayed the same all the way through World War II. Who was this guy Doolittle? He's known for the raid, but when I met his granddaughter about 8 years ago now, she was going around the country giving speeches about grandfather, and also grandmother for that matter. And she said, you know, the reason I do this is because high school kids have never heard of grandfather, and those who had heard about the raid, and that was all. So who was this guy? What did he do? First of all, when he was training, he was a very keen boxer and became the flyweight champion of the West Coast. I mean, he was a short guy, so he got into small airplanes, and a lot of small airplanes around in those days with small cockpits. So, and then he soloed right at the end, or at least he learned to fly right at the end of World War I. Soloed in March of 1918. Became an instructor, because right after the end of the war, there were not a lot of outlets for trained fighter pilots, so he had to go off and become an instructor. In 1922, he took a de Havilland 4 biplane and flew it between Fort Lauderdale via Kelly Field in Texas across to San Diego. The first transcontinental flight under 24 hours. I think it was 21 hours plus of elapsed time and about 19 and a half hours of actual flying time. That got him known. And several people, in fact, people from Curtiss-Wright, came along to the Army Air Corps and said, why don't you let this guy go to school? Because he had already made the point that not many pilots were engineers, much less engineers who were pilots. And he really pushed to say, hey, I'd like to get educated. I'm educated as a pilot to begin with, but I'd like to learn something about engineering. And he went off on an undergraduate engineering course, and the people at Berkeley, UC Berkeley, were persuaded to award him a bachelor's degree for that activity that he was involved in. And he went on from there to apply for a master's degree and a PhD from MIT. And this guy really wanted to know about how airplanes flew and why. And considering the time, that was quite something in those days. The guy was awarded a doctorate in 1925, but he was also winning the Schneider Trophy International Air Race in a Curtiss float plane in 1925 as well. Now imagine writing a PhD dissertation while you're winning an international air race. Now, Doolittle in 1929 performed what he felt was the thing he should be remembered for, the first blind flying demonstration. He got together with several industry people, including Elmer Sperry, and talked to Elmer Sperry about how to make an artificial horizon. And he already had a turn and bank indicator that he could use, and he talked to Elmer Sperry about developing a gyro compass. And with those 3 instruments, he felt he could fly blind. In 1927, he did just that. He flew a 2-seater, the back cockpit of which that he was in had a cover over it, and he was totally blind to take off, do a circuit, come back and land. And when you think about it, a blind landing was pretty scary in those days. And with those instruments, he managed to demonstrate the feasibility of doing all of that and tried to push that for the whole of his life. In 1930, he resigned his commission and actually joined, I think Dave will tell you about this, he joined the reserve and was involved with them from 1930 onwards. And he then realized, having raced for quite a while, he understood the significance of the fact that all the engines for most of the airplanes that raced at those days were all 6-to-1 compression ratio, because they couldn't go any higher because the thing started to pink or detonate. And he went to run Shell Oil Aviation outside the services and helped develop high-octane gasoline with General Motors. And but he was also back still in the racing business. He won these 2 trophies, which were well-known trophies around the time, and he went on to go back to the service at the behest of Hap Arnold, and again Dave will cover this one a little later, but he went back in, I think as a lieutenant colonel, right?
He was a major. He was a major when he was reactivated in 1940. Had been a major for 10 years, which was quite a long time. But then got promoted. But we'll talk about that in a couple minutes.
We get in there. So this is the kind of thing that this guy did. So he wasn't just known for the raid. This is a picture of him. As you see, he's not very tall, and he would fit into that little airplane. And that's a picture of him in the October Schneider Trophy race. This was a quote from Bob Considine. Bob was an author, and he was the guy who, along with the pilot of the number 6 airplane in the Doolittle raid, co-wrote 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, which then became a movie as well as a book. So, okay, 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor, 2 weeks, this was before Churchill turned up for Christmas, FDR pulled together some of his senior military advisors. Harry Hopkins here had been an advisor to FDR from the deep in the Depression time period, all the way through the 30s. And he had actually run some of the recovery programs that FDR had introduced during the recovery from the Great Depression. Hopkins was the Secretary of Commerce and was very close to FDR. He pulled him in, he pulled Henry Stimson in, who was the Secretary of War. He pulled Fred Knox in, who was the Secretary of the Navy. And along with that came Admiral King, Ernest King, who commanded the U.S. Navy, and Betty Stark, Admiral Stark, known as Betty all through his service career. He was the Chief of Naval Operations. Then, of course, George Marshall, who was Chief of Staff of the Army, and Hap Arnold, who ran the Air Corps. And he pulled these 3 together and was quite blunt with them. He said, I want you to go out, pulse all your people, and come back with ideas as to how we can respond to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And they all did just that. Mixed it up with Christmas fair and all of that good stuff, I think. But came back very soon afterwards, and one of the guys who had come forward in the process of trying to pulse the services was this guy, Francis Lowe. And Lowe was a submariner of all things, and he came back with a wild idea that said, look, we're going to try and hit Japan. We don't have any naval airplanes that can fly that far, much less carry a meaningful payload. So we're going to have to use an Air Corps airplane. And we need an airfield that's close enough to Japan that the range that they can meet or reach Japan. Can't do that, so let's use an aircraft carrier. And that was the thought process. He talked to Donald Duncan, who was Ernest King's operations officer, and they took the whole idea, having discussed it. They went back to see Hap Arnold. Hap Arnold bought into it and said, come on, let's go talk to the boss. So they went back to FDR, and they floated the idea in front of them, and they said, okay, let's do that.
So we'll get back to Jimmy here for just a few minutes, and we already discussed that he was a major when he came back on active duty. That was July 1st, 1940. And when he was doing some research for fuel and logistics for the Army and several commercial organizations, because he saw the handwriting on the wall, and that was probably going to need these car plants and some of these other organizations to build airplanes, and let's go see what they've got out there. So he did that for quite a while. Then along comes December 7th, 1941. If you do a little bit of simple math, you'll find December 7th, 1941 to April 18th, 1942 is only about 137 days. That's pretty quick. So they put that organization together, that task force, under Jimmy Doolittle. Let's jump forward to January 2nd, 1942. And in January 2nd, Jimmy was promoted to lieutenant colonel. And what I want to tell you is I was a lieutenant colonel for 5 years until I retired. Jimmy Doolittle was a lieutenant colonel for 113 days before he was promoted to brigadier general. He skipped colonel and went right on to brigadier general. There's guys on the list that are going to go, wait a minute, what's going on here? Well, the good news is Jimmy had Hap Arnold's back pocket. He could walk in and talk to Hap Arnold anytime. So Jimmy now is a lieutenant colonel, really doesn't have the mission, actually starting to talk a little bit about this idea, and it was after the idea was floated to Hap that using a medium-sized bomber that they could take off from an aircraft carrier. And by the way, Lowe got his idea because he was flying over an aircraft carrier one day, and he just flew over an air base where there was some medium bombers, and he put the two together. Medium bomber, aircraft carrier, maybe we could make this work. In fact, they did make it work, and they tried it out in the Atlantic to see if a B-25 could take off. And they took 3 B-25s and put them on an aircraft carrier and went out 120 miles. And they were successful in being able to launch those B-25s. One of them didn't fly, had some mechanical problems. But they were able to get those aircraft off that aircraft carrier, and they said, aha. Hence, Hap Arnold's now in the game, and Hap makes a call to Jimmy Doolittle. And the story is that Jimmy came and Hap asked him, what kind of aircraft do you think, medium-sized bomber, we could use off an aircraft carrier? And Jimmy said, you know, it's got to carry 2,000, the definition that they wanted was, got to carry 2,000 pounds of bombs, it's got to fly about 2,000 miles, because they kind of had this mission that they were going to fly from the Pacific over Japan, bomb Japan, and then go land in China. And Jimmy quickly and clearly said a B-25. And we're now at the B model of the B-25s, which were being produced by North American. And let's take a look at that. First, let's look at the map. You can see the logistics of that planning, and that planning was that they would be refueled, the task force would be refueled at about 1,000 miles out. So you can see it up there. Somewhere there, the refuelers would refuel all the ships. They would get within 800 to 500 miles, and 500 was the ideal, to get 500 miles away from Japan, and then they could launch. And supposedly it was going to be a night flight. In fact, Jimmy loaded his aircraft with incendiary bombs because he was going to be the lead aircraft, dropped incendiary bombs, and then all the rest of his 15 crews following him could see that fire and then use that as a way to get to their targets. Just to show you a quick snapshot, this is Jimmy Doolittle's plane, a drawing, B-25B model. Barry and I actually work with a D model B-25, Grumpy at Historic Flight Foundation, so we know this aircraft pretty well. And tail number on this is 02344, Jimmy's plane. And very clearly, Jimmy knew then, after some practice with his pilots, called together those fellows down to Eglin Air Force Base and began the practice of being able to take a B-25 off in less than 400 feet.
That was the idea. That was the airplane. By the way, on the airplane, when they first started looking at it, they said there's three candidates, really. B-25's one. That was the one that won out in the end. There's the B-23, which was a developed version of the B-18 Bolo airplane, twin engine. That one didn't have enough takeoff performance. And then the other airplane that they were going to use was the B-26 Marauder. But the Marauder had too big a wingspan, and they were worried about hitting the island on the ship. And they, first of all, Arnold said, okay, we got an idea, but he had to check with the boss first. So he went back to see FDR, and he said, okay, go for greatness. And they wanted to fly it off the Hornet. Now, the Hornet was the United States Navy's latest carrier,
Yep.
just finished its shakedown cruise, and was ready for its first operational venture. And this was its first operational flight, really. And when Hap Arnold said, go find the best crews for this airplane, they were mainly based over at McCord, just up the road here. And that was the 17th Bomb Group. And they were the most experienced pilots. So most of them came from at least being stationed in this area. As Dave said, they went down to Eglin, and there they trained until the word came on March the 23rd of 1942 that just said basically, Jimmy, get on your bike and get these guys up to Alameda to begin with. They flew them up to Alameda in the end. I think they made an impromptu stop at some hotel first, right?
They did, but they were at McClellan Air Force Base for about some restoration.
Right, so they were there for probably an overnight thing, but I think they wrecked a hotel basically, didn't they? They had quite a party down there the night before they went up to Alameda. And they then loaded the airplanes, 16 of them, and B-25s are not small airplanes, 16 of them onto the deck of the Hornet. And from Alameda, of course, that's inland from, or in the bay, from San Francisco itself and the Golden Gate Bridge. So when they came out, it was obvious that that thing was going somewhere. I think they put a story out that basically said, we're going to ferry these airplanes over to Honolulu and go from there. And then they departed from Alameda under the Golden Gate Bridge, full daylight vision of everybody, putting all sorts of cover stories out about where they were going. And at that point, they wound up joining up. That was Hornet leaving with the airplanes. And they joined up with Admiral Bill Halsey. Halsey was in the Pacific at the time, looking after the Southern Pacific Fleet. He raised his flag in the Enterprise, another carrier, and he had 4 cruisers with him. Salt Lake City, Northampton, Vincennes, and Nashville, and then a bunch of destroyers that were obviously there to protect the whole convoy, and 2 oilers so that they could replenish at sea for the whole thing. And that was, Halsey was then commander of what they called Task Force 16, which was the whole collective group heading towards the mission that Dave just indicated. They were told, first of all, that this was going to be the target. And at that point, Mitchell, who was the captain of the Hornet, he and Doolittle got in front of all the crews and said, "Hey, anybody want out? No questions asked. If you want out, say so." Not one guy came forward and said he wanted out. They all wanted to go. And as Dave just said, they refueled to plan at 1,000 miles. They loaded enough gas on the airplane, plus a 2,000-pound bomb load. And mainly they were, apart from Doolittle's airplane that was full of incendiaries, most of the others were a mixture of a minor number of incendiaries and mainly 500-pound bombs. However, 800 and some odd miles out from Japan, they spotted this boat, the Nito Maru. It was assumed to be a Japanese Navy picket boat, and Nashville sank it, but they were pretty sure that they'd got a message off over the radio before it sank, and sure enough it had. Tokyo was warned, by the way, several times. Didn't take any notice of it because, hey, the mainland of Japan is invincible. They said, look, we're going to ignore this. It's not a credible warning because the islands of Japan are invincible. We can't be raided. And at that point, Doolittle was watered off. 467 feet, I think, was his takeoff roll. Now, okay, they had wind over the deck and there was a storm running. So as you'll see in a minute, there was quite a lot of weather around at the time. In 2012, we took the B-25 that Dave mentioned up at Everett, and we flew it off in 467 feet from the runway up at Abbotsford. And I was on that airplane, and believe me, that was run the power up against the brakes, let go of the brakes and pull the stick back, because you were airborne in no time flat. It was quite amazing.
So now it's 8:20 in the morning, and this is the 18th. They were really scheduled to leave on the 19th during the day, so they would hit the Tokyo by dusk, so that Jimmy could drop those incendiaries and then scoot on to China. Well, I don't know how many of your pilots are out there, but I'm smart enough to know that if my radius was supposed to be 500 miles and now you just added 300 miles and I got the same amount of fuel, oops, something doesn't calculate. So immediately they knew that there was going to be a problem with fuel. They leave the deck of the Hornet. Jimmy was off at 8:20 in the morning, and his bomb run started at 12:20 noon. And something unique about Tokyo, even though they'd got the warning from the picket boat, what they had to going on in the city was civil defense, and they were doing civil defense air raids in Tokyo as a practice. Well, little did they know that they were going to make that practice real, and somebody was going to be coming dropping bombs. And that's one thing that was really unique about the whole attack. So you can see Jimmy lifted off. He was 400, just a little less than 400 feet off at the back. But the beauty was when Mitzer turned the Hornet into the wind, they got a 40-mile-an-hour wind across the deck, which really helped them. And like Barry said, full power, brakes on, pull that stick back, and Jimmy lifted off. There it is. You can see he makes it off with plenty of room and plenty of speed, and that's Mitzer standing up on that upper deck watching him take off. And so they were very fortunate. And the morale boost for the other 15 planes was they said, if the old man can do this, we can do it. And they were ready to go. Something that a lot of folks don't, I'm going to show this a couple of times so you can see, they got to clear that bridge that's on the aircraft carrier. So what they had done prior to is they painted a big, thick white line down the deck and a thin line. The left wheel would be on that big, thick white line, and the nose wheel would be on the thin white line. That way you had 6 feet of clearance not to hit the superstructure on the way. Worked out quite well. Jimmy's crew, and the important one in this crew was his co-pilot, who both of us knew and know about, a fellow that just passed away here not too very long ago. Dick Cole was Jimmy's, and this is Jimmy's crew. Lots of fun stories about Jimmy and what happened to him after he crash landed in China, but we'll talk about that maybe at question and answer. And the last crew I want to show is crew 15, and both Barry and I knew Ed Saylor.
Guy on the right there.
On the far right.
He was the flight engineer and the gunner on the 15 airplane. And the unique thing about Ed Saylor was that they'd been told by Doolittle, you better make sure your airplanes are in good shape, because if they're not, they're over the side.
Going to push them off.
Hang on, I got to talk in this thing. Ed Saylor was told by Doolittle, you better make sure your airplane's okay, because if they're not, the airplane's over the side and you're going back to Alameda with the Navy. None of them really wanted to do that.
Whoops.
So the night before the raid, Ed Saylor checks his airplane out.
That's Ed there.
And on one side, he finds, in the mag plugs, he finds half a key. And he thinks it's from something that's holding a gear inside the gearbox somewhere for the prop reduction gear. So he strips everything down on the deck at night and finds the other half of the key still in the keyway in the reduction gear. So he pulls that half out, pulls the two together, realizes they're the only two pieces, heads on down into the ship, finds one of the mechanics down there and says, got any mild steel and a hacksaw and a file? And he makes another key, puts it in. No way he can run the engine to find out whether it's okay. So he puts the key back in and hopes. The next morning, of course, it worked perfectly. And Ed Saylor, years later, somebody built it, a little shaft with a pinion on the end and a key that went along with it. And when he went around talking to various organizations in the world, he would have this thing with him so that he could show them to everybody. But there we go. This is where they're going. This is the raid itself.
So as we talked about earlier, they were going to do 5 cities. One of them's not up on the map, but they were going to do Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, and Kobe, right there, Kobe, and then another one that's not on the map. So each of the 16 birds had their assigned target, and they were able to attack those. But it was a daylight raid, not a nighttime raid.
Okay, what happened to the guys? Well, to begin with, they weren't going to make Chinese mainland, and a lot of them came up short. So most of them had to bail out. And the crews of 11 of those 16 bailed out either over China or over the coast of China. And one made it to a rice paddy and got out of it that way. Another group went off and decided to go to a backup finishing airport, if you like, and landed in Russia. The Russians impounded the airplane and impounded the crew and put them under house arrest because the Russians weren't really involved in this at this time. not until later on. Of the 80 guys, this is a statistic that always blows me away. Of the 80 guys who flew out on that mission, 62 of them made it back to the United States to fly again, which is quite amazing to me. 3 were killed on the night of the raid, as it says there. And somebody asked Dick Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot, later on, what was most scary? He said jumping out of that airplane into a black void. He didn't quite know where he was at that point. Several were captured by the Japanese, and as they say up there, 3 of them were killed later on in October of 1942. 1 of them died from natural causes, and the rest of them were repatriated at the end of the war. 10 of those people who survived that and got back to the US died later in World War II, and they were all over the world in every kind of theatre at the point. And this is where it becomes quite a reunion.
So beginning even 1 year after the raid in North Africa, Jimmy had a little party with those raiders and that was the beginning of a reunion. It wasn't officially a reunion that year, but it was a year later. And I got to tell you something. So I already said Jimmy was a lieutenant colonel for 113 days. Then he was a brigadier general. That was in 1942. And guess what? By the end of 1943, he was a lieutenant general. And I'm going, wow, what promotion? Well, I guess if you knew Hap Arnold and had Doolittle raid under your belt, your promotions are going to come pretty quick. And I think he got the 12th Air Force Command at the end of 43. So every year they would have a reunion. And in the 1950s, the reunion for the Doolittle Raiders was in Tucson, and the city of Tucson gave them these goblets. Now the goblets were engraved on both sides. One side was right side up, the other was upside down. We already know we have some of those 80 Raiders that the goblet would be in the case. Guess who built this case? Isn't that a nice case? Dick Cole. Dick Cole built the case after they received the goblets from the city of Tucson, and they were with them every year. And at Jimmy Doolittle's 60th birthday, Hennessy gave Jimmy a present. Bottled in 1896, Jimmy's birthday. When he was 60, they gave him that bottle of cognac. And the agreement was that they would only open that cognac when there was 2 left. And that changed because in 2013, they decided with 3, actually 4 left, that they were going to open that bottle of cognac. And that's was done at the museum in Dayton, Ohio. And Dick Cole led the toast. There was 3 of them. David Thatcher, Dick Cole, Robert Height, Lieutenant Colonel Height wasn't able to come. He was under the weather and not able to travel. But they did hook him up with being able to watch this on closed screen TV. And Dick Cole, David Thatcher, and one other. Ed Saylor, sorry. So the 3 of them opened the bottle of cognac and proposed a toast, and it was simple, and you can see it right there. Dick just wanted to toast to all those who were gone. And every year prior to that, the toast was done in a room not using that cognac, but using another bottle. And the toast was simple: to all those who've gone on before. And they would toast in a closed room, just the Raiders. And now they are all gone.
After the city of Tucson gave them those goblets, and Dick Cole made the case, they were given for safekeeping to the Air Force Academy to look after. And that was the final toast. And then Dick Cole, at 103, believe it or not, he died about a month ago. I think the 6th. It was the 6th. I think it was just a week ahead of the 77th anniversary. So that really was the end of an era for this whole thing, and one of the reasons that we felt it was necessary to recognize that anniversary. Now I want to point out that a lot of what you've seen there is written in one of the best books I've read in a long time. Sorry about that. Well, Calculated Risk. John Doolittle, as I said earlier on, Jimmy's granddaughter, said that she wanted everybody to understand about grandfather and also grandma. This is a real family book, this thing, because it does a lot about Joe Doolittle, who was his wife. And they had 2 kids, actually 3 kids. 2 kids, and then how many grandkids? 3 grandkids, I think. But that book should be in the store, and believe me, it's worth a read. So with that, that kind of tells you the story briefly of the Doolittle raid and the significance of it. So thank you.
That movie is all about Ted Lawson and the ruptured duck. And by the way, the ruptured duck was the only B-25 that almost didn't get off the carrier because Lawson forgot to put his flaps down. He had just neutral flaps. And they quickly went to a big blackboard and wrote flaps so that the other pilots could see it. But the beauty was he went off the end and disappeared, but he got his flaps down in time and ruptured duck, that aircraft.
What was the name of it?